Some new podcasters see interview podcasts as kind of an easy route into podcasting. Just write 15, 20 questions, invite a bunch of guests, and they'll do the rest of the work, right? Wrong. There are hundreds of thousands of interview podcasts out there already. And in order for your podcast to have the impact that you want it to have, you need to be tackling your interviews from a storytelling lens. And that's exactly what our guest today is doing. I'm Joe Eftihiou, your host, and I'm thrilled to have Helen McGuire on today's episode to talk about her podcast, D&Igest. In this episode, we cover the wide-ranging benefits of podcasting, from content marketing to self-improvement and sharing stories that the world needs to hear. Helen's company was recently acquired by the Access Group, and I ask her, how will an acquisition affect the podcast? We talk about leveraging existing networks to secure great guests, how Helen is able to tell from an email if a guest is right for her podcast, interview tips from a podcaster with a radio background, why you don't need to be on every single social media platform, speeding up your podcast production process, and so much more. Get ready to be inspired by the power of storytelling. Hi Helen, thanks for joining me on Podcasting Amplified. How are you doing?
Hello Joe, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I'm really well, thank you.
Good. So Helen's podcast, D&Igest, and I'll spell it just so you can find it. It's spelt then D&I as in diversity and inclusion, GEST. So it's an interview podcast where Helen gets personal with activists and allies who want to share their stories, both professional and personal, about what they've been through and how they're now making a difference in both their and others' lives. Does that still apply?
I think that definitely still applies, yeah. And you know, it's kind of a deep dive into those people's journeys, but very crucially, why that journey, I guess, forced them into a situation of having to do something differently, think differently, approach the problem differently, to make it better for other people who may be facing the same issues.
Yeah, because obviously I listened to your podcast, and every episode seems to have quite a different approach, a different kind of guest, very diverse group of guests. How you've been going for about 55 episodes now, I think. How easy do you find it to find guests that are right for the show?
So I don't find that a huge challenge. And I think that's because before I started the podcast itself, which was about, nearly 2 years ago now, actually, I've been working in the diversity and inclusion space for many years. So I have had 2 businesses in this space, the latest of which has just been acquired by the Access Group. And it was kind of my fascination with why people would get into the diversity and inclusion space in the first place. My journey into it as a white, straight, middle-class female is perhaps not super obvious to everybody, as in, why would I be speaking on behalf of underrepresented groups out there? But, you know, for me, it was really about the injustice that I saw when I had my first baby, for those around me, women who had, incredible backgrounds and careers, but unfortunately were being gradually chucked off the career ladder, to put it mildly, or were simply unable to get back on because of the lack of flexible work options available, the lack of out-of-the-box thinking, and just some of the biases that were creeping in, once women had kids or other caring responsibilities. And that struck me pretty deeply at the time, because I knew so many women who were being affected very negatively by that. And I wanted to stand up and make a difference. And I realized very quickly that those types of biases actually were something that so many people carried, but in many different varieties. So bias is unfortunately just something that all humans have in one way, shape, or form, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And obviously that can affect multiple underrepresented groups. And so I've been working in this space for, as I said, many years to try and come up with solutions for that, both service-based and technical. And so I'd already created quite a large community and network online, specifically on LinkedIn, and previously on Facebook and Instagram and what have you. So once I sort of put the call out there, that this was happening, it just snowballed. And there were some really obvious people that were non-execs on our board, for example, at the business, who were a great first port of call for this stuff. And then, if you get the right people on, their sharing of the podcast and their messaging also amplifies that message to others. And so, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, it wasn't too much of a challenge.
No, that's great. It's good to hear about the sort of purpose and passion that you had for starting it as well, as simply being for content marketing for your business. And then in terms of the interviews, you say it kind of snowballed. Do you think that the fact that it's been going for quite a while now helps, or do you think it's more just sort of who you know and leveraging your audience?
Yeah, I think definitely the reach of it now helps, and the fact that it has a history, let's say. So it's fairly obvious, I think, when you flick through the past 55 episodes or whatever, where we're coming from and what we're trying to address, and the message of, I guess, acceptance and understanding that we're trying to get to by interviewing so many different people, as well as who it is we're targeting on this podcast. So yeah, sure, it's definitely about those people who have had those experiences, but it's what they've then done with those experiences to change the game for others. So whether that's a business solution, whether it's a charitable solution, whether it's an in-person or a technical solution, whatever it may be, it's really about the activists in this space. So I think putting those two ingredients together, it's a broad enough niche, let's say, that it would be obvious whether you fit in that, whether you yourself or perhaps somebody that you represent fits in that category.
And you said people are now reaching out to you as well. So from other countries, from the US and things.
Yeah.
And you've actually interviewed some of the people that have reached out. Do you generally get sort of good quality connections through that? How many roughly do you think, like percentage wise, ends up being on an interview who reach out?
I'd say the majority, because, okay, from the people who reach out, I can make an initial assessment essentially on whether I think they will be a fit. And the challenge really with diversity and inclusion, I've hosted previous diversity and inclusion podcasts for other organizations. And if you solely focus on, let's say, a business angle or what a business is specifically doing in this space, it tends to get very repetitive very quickly, which is why I was keen not to repeat that angle on this podcast. So when I get those submissions in, I need to get a sense that that person has lived and breathed it themselves and has a story to tell, and isn't just trying to promote their business, the place that they work for, or whatever it is. To give you a good example, a recent podcast that we had on was a double header with two guys based in the US. They work for a business called Evolution, which is, on the surface of it, a coaching business, but they specialize in gay leadership. So leadership for LGBTQIA plus individuals. And they are trying to promote the fact that, unfortunately, over 50% of people in that community are not out at work. And that number is even higher when we talk about leadership, bosses, CEOs, C-suite, board members, etc. So they've created a community that encourages ways in which leaders can confidently navigate this journey. And it's a journey that they've been on as well. So they've taken on this mantle, if you like, this mission, because they've experienced challenges and they've seen how this can be so damaging to somebody's career as well as damaging to a business, because you're not tapping into the full potential of that individual. So that's a good example of, how it works well. But if it was somebody, let's say a coach who hadn't had that experience themselves and was simply trying to sell a course through my podcast, then for me, that's not a just enough reason to have somebody on my particular podcast. Not to say it wouldn't be a valid guest for another.
Yeah, because I think when people are trying to get guest slots on other people's podcasts, they'll spend time umming and ahhing about the email and how they're wording it and to show that they're giving a benefit to the host and everything. But it sounds like for you, the most important thing is just their experience and where they're coming from and whether or not they understand what your audience needs, as opposed to just like how they worded the email or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of the benefit of what you get from the podcast and what you're offering people, and there's the content marketing aspect of it.
Yeah.
What do you get yourself personally from the podcast? So you've been doing it for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
Where do you think you'd have been without it? What kind of skills have you gained from it?
Yeah. I mean, my background digging far back, far longer than I care to remember, is in radio. So I worked for the BBC in production on specialist radio shows as well as podcasts for many years, and previously had music-based podcasts as well myself from a host perspective. So it's pulling on a lot of those, that experience, those approaches of, how to find good guests, how to structure a conversation, an intro and outro. And the podcast is now sponsored as well, which is always great, by Access Volcanic, from a marketing perspective and a kind of trust perspective as well, giving it a bit of weight. So that stuff wasn't my primary reason for starting the podcast, but it was nice to, put those boots back on and walk in them, once a week or whatever it is. I really have enjoyed that aspect of things and just using those skills that I picked up during that fairly long period of time, producing other people's shows and other people's podcasts and what have you. But I think really the key benefit for me personally has been learning from these individuals and having the time to put myself in their shoes and hopefully place the listener in their shoes as well, to foster just a better sense of understanding of different perspectives on the planet. I think there's a lot of kind of fluff around diversity and inclusion. There is a lot of misunderstanding and probably pushback as well at this point from individuals and from businesses. And actually, I just want to give people a sense of why this is important and why it's super important to, remember that we are all people. We all have our reasons for doing things, and we all want a fair go in life. And making sure that those perspectives are aired, so that hopefully that message gets out to a wider audience, as well as to businesses, to be honest, to help them to understand how they can approach some of these issues, whether it be ADHD, whether it be disability, neurodivergence, sexuality, gender, whatever it may be for their business. So it really kind of ticks a lot of boxes for me. And I also just love the conversations. I can go into those conversations at the end of the Thursday or whatever, because I'm 4 hours ahead here where I live from the UK and even further from the US, feeling absolutely exhausted with the kids screaming in the background, and come out of it just feeling totally energized by the connection, and also just the proof points and the way that those people have overcome the enormous challenges, often, which have been far bigger than anything you or I could imagine, in their lifetimes, and are now turning it to good. So it's a very inspirational way to spend your time, and I hope that the listener comes away with that experience as well.
That's brilliant. Yeah, that you're getting that out of it, as well as obviously the listeners. Because you obviously pick, like you say, you pick guests who have a story to tell, and I think what it means is that for even somebody who isn't in the diversity and inclusion space, they could pick up pretty much any of the episodes and get something out of it, get emotional about it, just from hearing people's stories. Like just one example, the Jay Grange episode recently. I found that very emotional, and the fact that you were able to get his dad on for another episode, just for the audience. Jay Grange is a musician and a speaker, and he went through school with ADHD without getting a diagnosis, and he talks about his experience with that. And then you also had his dad with a completely different point of view, completely different experience on the other side of it on another episode. And it's just a great listen for anyone. And also it gives that sort of sense of continuity and gives people a reason to stay subscribed if you're going to be sort of branching off and exploring particular episodes deeper. In terms of growing the podcast then, what do you think's been the most effective thing for you? Is it just the quality of the episodes, the interviews? Or are you spending time? Do you need to spend much time marketing, or is it generally organic?
So for us, the podcast itself is, from a marketing perspective, is obviously very top of funnel. So it's really about not only reaching people who care about diversity and inclusion, but those that have to deal with it at work, whether by choice or not. And increasingly, that's a large proportion of the population. If you're working in recruitment, if you're working in talent acquisition, if you're part of a larger organization, there will be a diversity and inclusion group or person, strategies and policies and practices and so on. And it can feel very remote to people. So I think it's about bringing that home as much as possible and making it accessible, and doing that through, as you say, the guests that we have, and them then marketing it to their networks. So most of the guests that we have all of them are professional people. Jay, as you mentioned, speaks for the UN, for example, on childhood neurodivergence, even though he himself is only, I think I'm right in saying 22, might be 23 now. Sorry, Jay, I got your age wrong. His dad works for a charity and is an older guy, but has had a very sort of long career actually at the post office previously. I'm just picking two examples here, but they have relevant audiences who care about this stuff and who have to start thinking or implementing it potentially into their day-to-day at work. So it's about that reach and getting that right. I focus on LinkedIn exclusively because that's the platform that I use for the business. It's where I have my own community and network, as does the business, as does the wider business now that we've been acquired by the Access Group. So that's the platform that I use, and I ask all of my guests to promote it there as well, or obviously on the channels where they're most popular. And that's kind of where I think we've seen the growth. But I'm not an expert on podcast algorithms and so on, so I don't know how that momentum would necessarily work. But obviously the more relevant content you have on there, the more listens you get, the more likely you are to get bumped up there as well. So that has its own mechanism. And I think just having it focused, having it regular, having the quality there, as you say, not just in terms of the guests, but the recording quality as well, all counts towards the continuing build and success of it. Yeah,
and I've noticed you've been recently replying to people on LinkedIn, asking them to review after they've made a comment on there, because I think people don't realize you can do it still on podcast platforms, and it's a lot more effective if you're asking someone directly.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think people worry too much about getting on every single social media platform, like got to get on TikTok, got to get on LinkedIn, but and Instagram and everything. But if your market is on LinkedIn, you're better off sort of putting all your eggs into that basket.
Yeah, it is. And I think as much as I got into this space and specifically this podcast for obviously quite personal reasons, I guess, I am representing a business. And what I'm trying to
Yeah.
do is, with that business is to provide genuinely impactful solutions to help people like the guests that I'm interviewing, as well as businesses out there, so that these situations don't keep happening. So it's important for me and my time as a business to be using that as efficiently and effectively as I possibly can. So focusing, as you say, on where your audience is or where it's likely to be just makes the most sense. And, it's tough building a social media audience, whichever platform you choose, but you've got to be specific because each one will require a very different type of writing, a very different type of format, a very different type of picture or video or whatever it may be to get the algorithm working in your direction. And it's pretty hard to master that as an individual. That's almost a kind of full-time job just doing that if you're going to try and do it on all of them. That one type of content is not going to work for every single platform. So for me, kind of focusing on LinkedIn, where I understand how to get as much reach as I can, just makes the most sense.
Yeah. I think with a topic like diversity and inclusion, it's really important that content is put out there, because I'm sure there are plenty of people on LinkedIn, businesses on LinkedIn, that want to talk about it or feel that they should be doing something, and they just don't want to start the conversation. And when they're seeing your content popping up and other similar content, it kind of maybe brings them into that conversation.
Yeah.
Makes it feel easier. So your business Diversely was acquired by the Access Group this year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
How do you think that might affect the podcast at all, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's early days, so we were acquired by the Access Group, and the technology that we produce to essentially ensure inclusive hiring for businesses and candidates out there is now being integrated into some of their solutions, starting with Access Volcanic, which is now the platform that very kindly sponsors the podcast. So I don't, in terms of myself hosting it, in terms of the trajectory of the podcast, it's recognized that it has a place within the business for a good reason, and that will continue in its current format for now. So I think, you won't hear any dramatic changes from the podcast itself, but obviously our situation as a business is evolving. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's probably a good thing in both ways. Like, good for you, obviously, the recognition, and also that the podcast remains kind of personal, with you as the face, with you as the artist, so to speak, because that's what attracts people, isn't it? Personalities. And
I think so. I think it's kind of
yeah.
a trust thing. I mean, if I think of any podcast that I listen to, if they suddenly change the host, then it's not the same podcast. Simple as that. So yeah, I think, if that were to be the case, then it would be a different podcast with a different angle, or, whatever. But certainly as it stands for now, it surprises me how many stories there are out there and how many angles on things. I think I was just mentioning to you, we're speaking to the Fashion Industry Association, one of the board members there, about diversity in the fashion industry and something that he's doing specifically to tackle that. So I'm having that conversation this week, and I think it's, they came to me, and you wouldn't Google that. You wouldn't necessarily, it would take quite some time to find the right person who's doing that right thing within the fashion industry to really make a difference, rather than someone that's just going to come and spout a load of statistics at me. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And obviously you would probably lose that connection if you start to mess around with the angle or the host at some point during a podcast history.
Yeah. So you've got experience in radio, as you're saying, and putting a good interview together. So I think it would be a good opportunity to ask, do you have any interviewing tips on crafting a good interview and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. And I would say the first one is airtime. In my time, I've trialed for various different radio stations, including those that you may have heard of. And one of the feedback that I got at the time was, you can get to A to B, get from A to B, but you don't have the airtime. You don't have the comfort factor really on air when you're trying to do that. And that means that you're not expressing you as you. You're trying to be something else, or you're trying to drive to a certain point. And so what I mean by that essentially is just practice. And you won't get that in the first 10 episodes. You might not even get it in the first 20 episodes. But by the time you hit sort of somewhere between 30, 40 episodes, you'll start to just have a style. And also just don't over prepare. I think one mistake that lots of people make when they're starting a podcast is that they have this kind of prescriptive list of questions, which, by the way, nobody asks for. I mean, very rarely I ask for a list of questions before I start an interview. I give a sense of where we're going, the direction, and what we're covering, but I never send a list of questions unless I really, really have to. Because what that stops you from doing is listening. And the most important part of a good interview is listening to what the person's saying, responding to where they're going, picking up on those cues and taking it in an interesting direction. They're the ones with the story to tell, not you. And I think if you start to read from a list of 10 questions, suddenly it becomes your narrative and not their story. And that can be quite scary, even as someone who's done a lot of interviews. There's still moments where I think, oh my God, what am I going to ask next? Where am I going with this and what's going to happen? And then you can kind of draw on some of those sort of stock standard questions that you might have in the back of your mind if that ever happens. But equally, podcasts are not live, so it can always be edited, as you well know, Joe. So, I think just keeping those factors in mind and just making sure that you are delivering something that the audience would want to listen to, that you in that position would want to listen to. That's what a podcast is all about.
Yeah. I think that'd be really helpful for people, and something that people struggle with when they start an interview podcast, thinking that it would be a lot easier than a solo podcast. I think you can get away with preparing more for a solo podcast because it doesn't rely on the other side of the conversation. But that's definitely something that I've struggled with, particularly for YouTube content, when it's very obvious if you're reading off something. And I just think I'm making all these mistakes, and I think to myself, I know what I'm talking about. Why don't I just talk about it rather than talk about it in this specific way that I've written down?
It's so true. It's such a good point to make. I think there's two methods of communicating. There's communicating what you think you should be communicating, which comes from a different part of the brain, and is you sort of tapping into what you can remember about that you've read, that you've listened to, or these bullet points or whatever it may be. And then it's just communicating from your own experience and sort of from your heart, really. Because as you say, generally speaking, when you're doing this stuff, you've done it 100 times already. You know what you're talking about. You're giving yourself an extra barrier by trying to remember and force yourself down a particular pathway that comes across as almost less knowledgeable and probably less authentic as well. But it just takes practice to move past that point and get to that kind of more authentic angle.
Yes. Yeah. I think practice is the big takeaway. But yeah, I mean, I can tell listening to your podcast that it's not about an A to B, because I'll listen through two episodes and there won't be a single question that's the same on either of them. Obviously, there are certain ones that are always going to be valuable to your audience. But yeah, generally, especially for sort of more story-driven interviews, then it's difficult to plan it all out. Yeah,
because they're not questions, they're conversations. And how often in a conversation do you ask an outright question? Like, not actually that often. I think it's about, definitely, it should certainly be much more about them talking than me talking, obviously. but it's about prompts and it's about digging in a bit deeper and so on, rather than outright big topic questions. Because you get there in the end, and you get there in a much more impactful and emotional way if you listen to what they're telling you and how they're speaking as well, I think.
Do you think that most of the skills that you've needed have come from your radio experience, or did you have to listen to other podcasts, or I mean, I guess you had an interest in podcasts to begin with, but have other podcasts influenced how you conduct your interviews and run your podcast at all?
I'm sure they have in a subconscious way. Podcasts were not a cool thing when I was producing podcasts. They were very much sort of in the shadows, in the background. There were no podcasting platforms. You'd find them, they were called atomized content at one point, when I was producing them for Radio 1 and so on. So they only really exploded, 4 years ago, probably, pandemic, just a bit pre-pandemic, and then just became a massive thing during the pandemic. So I don't know. I think I've probably absorbed a lot over a very long period of time of just how to put a beginning, a middle, and an end to an interview and a podcast and a show and a story and all of that stuff together, as well as sort of how to get that story out there and find the right people to talk about it and what have you. I would say most of the stuff that I know is from my radio background. Some of it is no doubt from listening to other people, but I don't deliberately go out there and copy anybody else's style or approach. I can't think of anybody who's really influenced that.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell, also from your intro and outros as well, that you're just sort of speaking. I mean, you record them straight after, just speaking about your sort of podcasting process. You just dive into recording the intro and outro, don't you?
Yes.
It's not like you got this specific style you're emulating, or it's all scripted and stuff. And I guess that just takes practice to be able to quickly distill a whole conversation straight after you've had it into a 1 minute.
Yeah, it does. But it's, for me, the easiest way of doing it. So if I tried to do that separately, and I have, at the beginning, completely separately to the recording, let's say I forget to do the intro and outro, which, as you know, does happen, and I have to do it completely separately, or, I would have to do it at the beginning. It would be nowhere near as easy to do, because I'm already in the flow of it, and it's what I've just spoken about with that person is completely top of mind. The tone of that as well. As you say, some podcasts are more emotional, some are more funny, some are more serious, whatever it may be. So you kind of want to get that tone wrapped up in that intro and specifically into the outro as well. And, I have a lot of other things going on. This is very much a sort of side thing for me, along with everything else that I need to do for the business, as well as kids and all the rest of it. So, if I tried to remember all of the conversations and record the intro and outro separately at a different point, I'd probably forget half the conversation. So, I think that's the most impactful and easy way for me to do it. And as you say, it then comes across as very genuine, because I am genuinely coming off the back of how I feel about that person's story, and the conversation that we've just had.
And then final question, if you were to record another 50 episodes, say, give it another couple of years, is there anything you'd like to see differently about the podcast? Where do you hope that the podcast would be, or is it just continuing sharing those messages?
So for me, I knew that once we got to episode 50, I wanted to get some bigger voices and some bigger guests on there, some more kind of household names in inverted commas, if you like, because I think you have that trust there built up with the audience, but also hopefully with potential guests, that you're going to handle those issues sensitively and hopefully talk to them in a way that perhaps they wouldn't publicly speak or air their, story or whatever it may be. So that's one thing I would really like to see. I'd also like to focus a little bit more on the challenges that people face. So as well as some of the amazing things that they've done, what are they still struggling with? And that, about the solution, essentially, about what they're building and what they're trying to do in the world. And is there a way that other people out there could potentially then reach out to them to help them? There's lots of people that listen to that podcast. It might be that they could find some help off the back of it. So to make it a bit more interactive. And then I think also, it would be nice to get it out there more broadly and start to explore what kind of podcasting awards there are, whether we can start to take it onto more of a live platform and do something, at some of the bigger podcasting events in the UK, for example, just taking it off the page a little bit, so to speak, and making it more interactive with people, both in a live and an online sense.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves. So if anyone wants to listen to the podcast, obviously you can search the Digest in Spotify, iTunes, anywhere you get your podcasts. And if anyone wants to reach out because they think they might know a guest or they think they might be a good guest, what's the best way of reaching out?
Just get me on LinkedIn, Helen McGuire. You'll find me. Search for the Digest or Diversity, Helen McGuire on LinkedIn, and just ping me on there. I'm super active on there, so I'll always reply to a message. Although possibly not immediately. Sometimes messages do get buried on there a little bit, so sorry about that. But I definitely will reply at some point. And I would love to hear, any feedback. And as you say, reviews and 5-star ratings are always very, very welcome. So any of those would be brilliant as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for joining me on Podcasting Amplified. It's been a fantastic guest.
Thank you, Joe. I really enjoyed it.
I'm sure our listeners get a lot out of it. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.